From the LifeWord Studios, this is Life Perspectives with Michael Goring.
Joining me today is an award-winning journalist, pro-life advocate, and Christian apologist, Megan Almon. Thanks for joining us today, Megan.
I'm so happy to be with you, Michael. Thank you.
So you've been a passionate advocate for the pro-life movement for many years. What initially sparked your interest in defending the sanctity of human life?
Yeah, good question. I was working as a journalist, and so my passion prior to that had always been art and storytelling. I was telling people stories, and then when I did my art, which I still enjoy from time to time, it was always people. I wanted to draw people. I wanted to study people. And so I was working at a local newspaper to my husband's hometown, which is Noonan, Georgia. That's where we lived for about 15 years after we got married. And I was sent to cover a pro-life event that kind of caught me by surprise. My editor actually came in and said, hey, the girl who was supposed to go cover this event left early. So you need to get your camera and go. So I had to call Tripp, my husband, and tell him I'm going to be late. The event turned out to be at the fundraising banquet for our local pregnancy resource center. And since it was a community paper, this was a big community event. And so I went. The speaker at that event was the great Scott Klusendorf, who was the president and founder of Life Training Institute.
Yep.
And I would have called myself pro-life at the time that I covered that event. But when I heard him open his mouth and begin to speak and offer a pro-life apologetic, which is reasons for the pro-life view being true as it is grounded in the larger Christian worldview, I was simply captivated. Because at the core of what he was talking about was, what does it mean to be human? And what does it mean to be valuable as a human being? And those were all the things that hit my tuning fork. And from that moment forward, really, I decided, you know what, those are the stories that I want to be telling.
Yeah. So in your experience, what are some of the most common misconceptions that people have about the pro-life movement?
I think a lot of it is fed by the narrative in our culture, right?
Sure.
I think the leading stories that we hear in culture is that abortion services, though you won't hear those words anymore, you'll hear reproductive freedom or women's rights or women's health care, that these are ways that we love women well. That there are so many difficult stories out there surrounding, pregnancy and when a woman wants to have children, that in order to care for women in our culture, we really need unlimited access to abortion. I think that's what most people hear and believe. And because people are naturally and rightly compassionate, when we hear about some of these hard cases that we often hear about when it comes to the abortion issue, a woman who can't afford to feed another child, so they're stricken with poverty, or a woman who's in a really tough situation. She doesn't have the support of her partner or her family, or even more difficult cases involving other very touchy things, such as the health of the child or the health of the mother. I think that people, without thinking through the issue completely, land in a place that says, this is something that actually helps these women. But of course, that assumes that the unborn children that are also at the heart of this issue are not human like the rest of us.
Yeah. You've spoken on various platforms about the importance of speaking the truth about life and family. What's one of the most effective ways to engage someone who may hold differing views on these topics like the sanctity of human life?
Good question. I think that there's probably a two-part way to approach that. One is that listeners begin by equipping themselves to understand why the pro-life view is true and why they stand where they stand. And that can be summed up in about 1 minute. If somebody were to ask me, why are you pro-life? My answer would go something like this. I'm pro-life because the science of embryology tells me that from the moment of conception, you and I were living, distinct, whole human beings. And there's no morally relevant difference between the embryos that we once were and the adults that we are today that would have made it okay to have killed us back then, but not now. In fact, the differences we can point out: size, level of development, environment, degree of dependency. That's a famous acronym called SLED. But those differences wouldn't have made it okay to have killed you then and not now. Now, in doing that, we can understand that scientifically and philosophically, not only are the unborn fully human, but they're also just as valuable as you and me. And so when we stand in that posture, which I think is grounded ultimately in the Christian teaching of the Imago Dei, right on page 1 of the scriptures, then we can engage with the world from a position that is confident, that is telling a better story to people as to why they matter. And I think from there, with that understanding, we can use those scientific and philosophical tools, but really, we just need to ask really good questions of the people we're talking to. We want to understand why they think the way that they do. Like I said, largely, people's positions on the issue of abortion are driven by compassion. And we all understand that abortion causes pain. No matter where you stand on the spectrum from pro-choice to pro-life, we see that. And so if we can meet people there and then guide them through questions, or really listen through questions to the story they have to tell, we can meet them with both compassion and the truth of the pro-life view.
Yeah, that's good. So as a cultural landscape surrounding what we would call life issues, as they continue to change, what changes or challenges have you observed in the pro-life movement over the last few years?
Over the last few years, I think that what we have seen is a little bit of the heat turn up when it comes to the issue. It's become much more, well, it's always been a polarized issue, but I think it's become even more polarized, as it were, particularly with platforms like social media, or in the media, or in the stories that we see in popular media, on television, and in our films. I think because of that, and because of the inundation of information that we're all kind of in right now, people haven't really taken the time to think carefully about this issue, about the intricacies of the issue, which is why I think that through the asking of questions and listening to where other people are and taking the time to see, to hear, and then to offer these truths, we kind of push back against that cultural narrative of, I just need that 60-second soundbite and I need to go from there. So that's one of the biggest changes I've seen. Other than that, a positive change that I've seen in the young adults that I work with is the types of questions they're asking right now are really demanding better answers to the issue. So we work, my husband works with Summit Ministries, and we work with a lot of young adults here at Summit Ministries. And of course, the young people who are coming here are typically from Christian homes, not always, but they want to know the truth behind these issues. So I do think that there's an opportunity in our cultural moment to have better conversations around this. But yeah, biggest change is that, especially in the last couple of election cycles, with the overturn of Roe v. Wade a couple of years ago, is that the heat has been turned up and the objections have gotten louder, probably not better, just louder.
Yeah. And there's two questions, I guess, that kind of offshoot from what you've just said. And I'll start with this. You just touched on it. What do you consider to be one of the greatest victories for the pro-life movement during your time in advocacy? Would that be overturning of Roe versus Wade?
I think on the legal landscape, yes. The law is a teacher. And we see that with many other issues, not just the abortion issue. In 1973, when Roe versus Wade was put into place at the federal level, most of the nation was not in favor of abortion. And very quickly, we saw those sentiments change because now abortion was legal at the federal level. It took away the decision-making power from the states. Now, the overturn of Roe v. Wade was a victory in that it gave deciding power back to the states. I do think that for many people, the thinking was that when Roe v. Wade is overturned, that will outlaw abortion. That was never going to be the case. What happened when Roe v. Wade was overturned is that we, the people of the United States, received our voices again. And at the state level, we now have a say on the issue of abortion. I think that in many ways, the larger population, the pro-life population that wasn't as, I guess, up to date on things, wasn't really prepared for that. And so now with, again, the rising of the heat, the objections that are out there, the fear that they're instilling in the minds of people when it comes to women's health, things like that, I think that some of that has affected the way that people are viewing this time right now. So yes, the overturn of Roe v. Wade was a tremendous victory at the legal level. There's still a lot of work to be done at our local levels and in the conversations we're having with family, friends, and others.
So beyond the legal victory, I guess more from a practical standpoint, what has been one of those victories that you've seen from a more local or relational standpoint?
I think one victory that I'm seeing is that we're still talking about it.
Yeah.
The issue of abortion has not a settled matter in our country. And that's actually good news. That means that the conversation is there and able to be had. I think that one of the things I've seen recently in the last few months in November with states like Florida, where abortion was on the ballot as something that was, it could have been embedded into the state constitution in Florida, and Florida by a very narrow margin said, no, we do not want that in our state. So we're seeing these battles happen at the state level, but there's so much work to be done. Again, that narrow margin where things are fairly even. Because it is being talked about, there's a tremendous opportunity in the church to not only have these conversations, but to ground the pro-life view into the biblical worldview, the larger biblical worldview that's taught and talked about in our churches. I think that when the church shies away from the issue, which I understand there's a lot of fear surrounding the issue, there's a lot of desire not to cause pain for those in the congregation who've had a brush with the issue of abortion, that's understandable. However, what we see is that abortion already causes pain. And by not talking about the issue, we don't really spare people pain. We might spare them the healing that the gospel message can bring.
Yeah.
So by talking about the issue more, again, the victory here is that we are able to talk about it and the conversation is ongoing. By speaking to the issue in a way that is grounded in that larger pro-life view, right? Science, philosophy, and the theological grounding that's there. We're telling this culture that Christianity has something relevant to say about the issue. Christianity offers healing for those who have walked through abortion or who have paid for abortion or who have supported it in the past. And ultimately, Christianity has a better story to tell people about who they are and why they matter.
Yeah, that's good. A few minutes ago, you talked about social media. With the rise of online platforms, Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, and the like, how has digital engagement influenced the pro-life movement? And how can pro-life advocates effectively utilize those tools to make a broader impact?
I think that the rise of social media hasn't just impacted the pro-life movement, but all of the conversations that we're having on these hot button issues, right?
Yeah.
Oftentimes the temptation is either one, to fall back on sound bites because the nature of social media engagement is very brief.
Yeah.
And also too, the temptation to forget that just because we're hidden right behind a screen, we can just say whatever we want to say. I think that if we apply conversational principles to social media, there can be some success there, perhaps through the asking of good questions, perhaps through the careful wording of our replies. The positive there is that with social media, you do have time to think through the words that you put out there. And I think with social media engagement, when we're talking to someone, it should be as if they're sitting right in front of us. We want to be respectful with our tone, as it were, and with our words, though that can't always be carried across through that platform. Ultimately, I think the best conversations are had one-on-one and face-to-face, but there are many brave warriors out there on social media doing incredible work, just with the careful wording of their responses, the asking of questions, being careful by trying to achieve clarity, and not building straw man arguments. They want to know, what is it you're saying? What is your argument? Let me interact with that to the best of my ability.
Yeah. So, can you share a story or an experience where you saw the pro-life message? We've been talking about the message, where that's made a tangible difference in someone's life or in their perspective.
I can share many of those. I'll try to think of just a few for this purpose. I've had the advantage of doing this for many, many years. And I will say, Michael, that when somebody comes to me and says, what you said changed my mind, that's a really good day, because it takes a lot of courage to change your mind about our deeply held convictions, especially over an issue that is held as close to our vest as abortion is for many people.
Yeah.
We've done a tremendous amount of work with students, as I've said, and I've had students who have come, and because they've been convinced of the truth of the pro-life view, they were then further, had more curiosity about the Christian worldview in which it was grounded. So those who began to investigate Christianity because they heard a presentation about abortion. I'm thinking of one in particular, a student in particular that I met. Her first name is Bridget. That's what I can give you. I met her when she was 13 years old. She heard a case for the pro-life view at a large conference. And she came back to the same conference the second year when I was doing a breakout session. And I learned at that time that Bridget had been at the conference, had heard the pro-life view, and not only was she convinced of her own value, which is something that comes through that pro-life message and something that she was struggling with at the time, but she was also convinced that if this is happening, this injustice of abortion is happening, that she needed to do something about it.
Wow.
So she started about the next week or two, begged her parents, grabbed her best friend, and began doing sidewalk counseling at the Planned Parenthood. And this was in the Pacific Northwest. And that next year, she came to me to say, I've been doing this for the last year, every weekend that I can get out there. And last week, my friend and I were there, and we changed a woman's mind, and she didn't have the abortion. She said, Megan, we saved a life. And she was right. She saved a life. Now this young woman is working full time with a pro-life ministry, doing sidewalk counseling as often as she can. And if you guys think of Bridget, then do pray for her, because that's an incredibly hard job, but incredibly fulfilling. And she has a book of baby pictures now of the lives that she has saved, or that she has helped save.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
That's the power of the gospel at work in people.
Yes.
Yeah. You oftentimes, Megan, talk about the intersection of faith, culture, and life issues. How do you think the family unit plays a role in shaping a culture that respects the sanctity of human life?
Wow, good question. Well, it makes sense in a culture like ours that if the enemy wants to attack somewhere, he's going to attack at the foundations. When we talk about the pro-life view, we're talking about the foundations. Like I said, the undercurrent is, what does it mean to be human? What does it mean to be valuable as a human being? And if the enemy can attack on the grounds of making us question or change the imago Dei and what it means, then he's really done some successful work. I think that the family is another of those institutions that God founded. There are some wonderful books out there. I remember a book by C.R. Wiley called The Household and the War for the Cosmos. Curious little title, so I picked it up and read it. And he was right. He was talking about the fact that households, understood not just in the American nuclear family context, but households throughout history have served as these microcosms in which we find our place so that we can ultimately learn our place in the larger cosmos. It's in the household, in a family that is functioning as it should, where we learn things like how to participate with others, how to extend forgiveness, how to make mistakes and learn from them. We've even learned practical tips of how to be a good member of society, right? In a fully functioning household, even an imperfect one. And study after study will show you that. And so I think that when you're in the household, there are things that are passed from parents to children, from grandparents, aunts, uncles, and others to children generationally that help us carry on these important truths. And they're not all done propositionally like we're doing right now. There's a lot that is taught in a household, but there's so much more that is caught in a household.
Mm.
And I think that when you have, parents who are doing their best to faithfully follow God and who are doing their best not to succumb to fear or things like that on these other issues, but to know in their core that Christianity has relevant things to say to these issues, who are passing that confidence along, who are willing to answer questions, or if they don't know the answer to questions, who are willing to say, you know what, daughter or son, that's a great question. Let's wrestle through that together, because I'm confident that there is a good answer to your question. And then they reach out and find resources if it comes to the abortion issue, like Life Training Institute or Apologetics Inc., which is the organization I'm currently a part of, doing incredible work, or Summit Ministries, where your son actually attended, as we were talking about earlier, and many students come. So I think that the household working in that way really prepares those students to step out into the world with confidence. They might not know everything, but they are grounded in such a way that they can move forward with confidence that Christianity is true and that it ultimately answers can be found.
Yeah. And to that, Megan, what do you see as the biggest threat to the traditional family structure today? And then how do we, I mean, from a practical standpoint, how do we address that issue in a way that strengthens families?
Mm. Gosh, the biggest threat to the family structure today, there are many threats that are out there, right? I think if we go back to understanding the Imago Dei, and particularly understanding as a piece of that what it is that makes us valuable as human beings. We live in a society that is very driven by the way that we function, the way that we perform. Our value in society is found through all of these things. And we have so many avenues telling us that truth, whether it's school, whether it's our jobs, whether it's, the way the social media, goodness, is such a platform that generates things like comparison. And so I think that if we can come back to understanding that our worth, as the pro-life view will tell you, rests in the fact that we are human. And it really is that simple. That value has already been established. It was established by our maker, and no one can take it from us. When we begin there, that begins to inform the way that we navigate through the world. And Christians are just going to look different than other people for those who walk in that truth. So
Yeah.
maybe it's an acceptance of the fact that I'm just going to look different, and that's going to be okay. I think Christians who adopt those truths tend to move at a little bit of a slower pace than the culture around them. The temptation in this culture, because it is performance driven, is I've got to be productive, I've got to be efficient. And as the great theologian, current theologian Kelly Kapic wrote in his wonderful book, You're Only Human, it's a book that talks about limits and the goodness of limits as things that God gave us prior to the fall. He talks about the fact that productivity and efficiency are our culture's highest virtues, but they are not God's highest virtue.
Mm.
His highest virtue is love. That our greatest commandment is to love God, to love our neighbors as ourselves. And love, as Kelly Kapic will tell you, is just about the most inefficient thing that we can do. So I think it's a going back to those ultimate things, those questions, that settling into our limits, the goodness of those limits, our value as dictated by that Imago Dei teaching. And of course, scripture centered everything from that point forward.
Yeah.
Those are some big threats. If I had to put names on them, I would say, again, the enemy's attack at what it means to be human. And then from there, the temptation to fall into those traps of, I've got to surpass my limits in order to be someone. No, you're already someone, and so are your children. And we get to, out of God's grace, work out of that place with joy.
Yeah. Faith plays a significant role, I know, Megan, in your life, in your advocacy. How do you rely on your faith when facing difficult or discouraging moments in your work as an apologist, as your work as a pro-life advocate?
Ooh. I mean, it's the thing that's formed me.
Right.
and is forming me, right?
Yeah.
And so I think when difficulty comes, I go back to the promises. I mean,
Mm.
God's word is the bread of life. That's what man doesn't live by bread alone, but by every word, right?
Yeah.
Is what Jesus said. And so oftentimes it comes back to those central truths, a reminding of myself of what is true, what I do know, and what I can know, a reminding of who God is, of who I am in light of what Christ has done, in light of the gospel. And I think when I settle back into those larger truths, it puts things in perspective. It kind of slows the rest of the world down. Doesn't make everything easy per se, but we are people of hope and not people of just optimism. Optimism tends to run out, but hope is something that is anchored. It's something that doesn't get shaken. It's the thing that at your core, you're still okay when everything around you is tumultuous or hard, when the person in front of you doesn't like what you're saying or doesn't agree with you. I think it's the core or that anchor of faith and that hope of the resurrection to come that ultimately keeps Christians grounded, going, you know what, when things get hard, even if optimism runs out, people of hope get creative and they find another way to keep moving forward.
Yeah. That's good. As we wrap up today, Megan, I was looking through some of your most popular, um, I guess, talks or presentation that you give, and I was drawn to the bankruptcy of moral relativism.
Mm-hmm.
And what can we learn about how moral relativism has impacted cultural dialogue?
Yeah, moral relativism is the view of morality that says that there is no real right or wrong, nothing that is grounded beyond our either cultural standard of right or wrong or personal standard of right or wrong. In other words, morality is subjective. It's up to us to define for ourselves. Of course, the danger of that is that if something is truly subjective, then it's not really real.
Yeah.
As you know, C.S. Lewis still did it best, I think, with his moral argument in Mere Christianity, when he talked about the fact that for morality to be real, it has to be transcendent. It has to come from somewhere beyond us.
Yeah.
And he wasn't the only one who thought that. Christians weren't the only ones who thought that. Even the Greek philosophers, the big three, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, these guys were operating on that principle too, which is why they talk so much about virtue and duty. In order for these things to be real, in order for us to have a guide to live our lives by, it must be real and it must come from somewhere beyond us. So naturally, when we're talking about issues like abortion or other moral issues that we're facing right now, that foundation makes a huge difference in the way that we would understand these ideas and in the way that we would communicate these ideas with one another.
Yeah. Megan Almon, thank you so much for this important informative and engaging conversation today. To learn more about Megan and her ministry and her advocacy, visit meganalmon.com. I'm Michael Goring, and this has been Life Perspectives. Thanks for watching.